Good evening or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to SFC's first ever Student Research Festival. We are hosting 3 graduate or upper year undergraduate students this week to share their emerging research in natural resources. This festival is an opportunity for students to share their knowledge in a friendly, low-pressure environment with other students who are passionate about balancing the needs of people, the planet, and prosperity. This is our first research event, but we hope to host more. So please follow SFC on social media at Students for Canada on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook to hear about our future events. For those of you who are just seeing SFC for the first time, we are an advocacy group made by students and young professionals for students and young professionals who believe that Canada can have a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. SFC is so thankful to our supportive membership, Erin included. Today's festival presentation stars Erin Charchuk, a final year student at the University of Lethbridge in geography. Erin's project focuses on his involvement as an environmental consultant in the oil and gas industry of Northern Alberta and his role in ensuring responsible land development in and around wetland systems. He will review his research on how wetlands are classified and delineated, the policies put in place to protect those highly valuable ecosystems, and the advancement of GIS methods to improve accuracy and efficiency for better wetland management and protection.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today as I give my presentation for SSC's first ever Student Research Festival. My name is Erin Charchuk. I'm an environmental science undergrad at the University of Lethbridge, and I'm excited to be here. The research that I'll be presenting today involves wetlands and how they are managed in areas of resource extraction and land development. My research is part of my degree requirements, and it has been a helpful learning experience as I transition into becoming a young professional in the workforce. Wetlands and watershed ecosystems have not only been a significant aspect of my biology and geography classes, but they have been significant during my previous work experience as a junior environmental consultant. Over the last 2 summers, I have worked for Roy Northern Land and Environmental, a well-established environmental company in the oil and gas sector of Northern Alberta, where I have started and continue to build a strong background as an environmental scientist. My research goal was to help introduce new and innovative ways of providing environmental solutions to assess wetlands and avoid the impacts on these ecosystems. The University of Lethbridge has provided me with a skill set and awareness of using maps, more specifically, creating, managing, and analyzing them in such a way that I interpret the landscape without the physical need to be there. This is called Geographic Information Science, or GIS for short, and is how I intend to be innovative when assessing wetlands and trying to minimize impact. So here we go, practical environmental solutions, GIS methods for watershed assessment and impact. Due to my experience in connection network, my research is mostly concentrated towards Alberta's oil and gas sector. This may be familiar to some, but not to others. However, I hope to showcase how this energy sector exemplifies Canada's leadership in environmental regulations and sustainability. My deliverables for this presentation include creating awareness of the rules and regulations for responsible land development in the resource industry with examples from Alberta's oil and gas sector. 2, provide information regarding wetland science, mitigation, and replacement. And 3rd, to provide information regarding GIS and how it can be applied to improve wetland management. Before I get into the GIS side of things, I feel the need to provide background about wetlands and how they are managed. A good place to start is the Alberta Wetland Policy. The policy provides strategic direction and tools for informed management decision with long-term goals of sustaining environmental, societal, and economic benefits. This policy is complex and requires a multidisciplinary approach and will therefore be used as a foundation to create awareness of the rules and regulations for responsible land development in Alberta and Canada's resource industry. The reason for such a complex and multidisciplinary approach for protecting wetlands has to do with their significant importance to the environment. Wetlands are poorly drained depressional areas that have become saturated with water over time. They are highly diverse, productive ecosystems and support a rich array of biodiversity. They provide critical habitat for different plant species, migratory and breeding water birds, and several species at risk, such as the northern leopard frog, trumpeter swan, whooping crane, and woodland caribou. Wetlands also mitigate the effects of floods and droughts by storing and slowly releasing water, recharge groundwater tables, store and sequester carbon, and improve water quality by filtering nutrients and contaminants. Wetlands also provide a wide variety of activities and resources to humans, play an important role for environmental and wildlife conservation, and have significant value to First Nations and Métis communities' culture, tradition, and knowledge. In the picture shown here, there's a breeding pair of trumpeter swans with chicks. These are migratory birds and an example of a species at risk, which I mentioned before. They post up in a marsh wetland along the highway near my hometown, and I've been keeping an eye on them over the last few summers because they seem to keep coming back each year. These trumpeter swans are only around in the spring, summer, and fall when they are breeding, but typically migrate to the west coast for the winter. On a side note, ornithology, or in other words, bird science, is a special interest to me. I've been fortunate enough to be part of bird suite projects for Roy Northern. This is where we look and listen for birds to identify which species are around, nest areas, and whether chicks have fledged or not. With this information, we can determine if it is safe and responsible to proceed with proposed development jobs. Keeping in mind the intentions of sustainability while maintaining the benefits of the environment, the government of Alberta has put in place and updated a variety of actions prior to the Alberta Wetland Policy, which was finalized and implemented in 2013. Such actions include Water for Life, Alberta's strategy for sustainability. This was an essential framework that was put in place in 2003 and later revised in 2008 as recommended by Alberta Water Council. This strategy has three main objectives to ensure safe and secure drinking water, healthy aquatic ecosystems, and reliable quality water supplies for a sustainable economy. The recommended updates of this provincial strategy were put in place to accelerate action, enhance tools and best practices, and improve data collection and analysis. A key action of this update was to finalize and implement a new wetland policy to replace the old Wetland Management in Settled Areas of Alberta, an interim policy of 1993. The updated policy is now referred to as the Alberta Wetland Policy. The Alberta Wetland Policy improves Alberta's wetland conservation and wetland management since it provides clear direction and guidelines. The primary legislation for implementing this policy is the Water Act. The purpose of the Water Act is to support and promote the conservation and management of water, including the wise allocation and use of water. Since this act recognizes wetlands as a water body, wetlands are subject to this legislation and an application regarding any potential wetland impact is required. Public Lands Act is another legislative body that is often included when submitting an application. The Public Lands Act deems ownership of permanent and naturally occurring water bodies of water, which is a wetland according to Water Act, to the government of Alberta. The applications that I mentioned are part of the responsible planning process to help ensure a balance between sustainability and attaining the benefits of natural resources. These applications are in the form of a report and is often a service provided by environmental consulting companies, such as Roy Northern. This is something that I'm often a part of, but since my work is mostly in the field, I help collect wetland data and determine their boundaries. This is where GIS comes in because the information I collect is mapped and later used for the report. The report is called a Wetland Assessment and Impact Report and is submitted either to Alberta Environment and Parks or Alberta Energy Regulator. Since Alberta Energy Regulator is responsible for administering legislation for all oil and gas activity, the Wetland Assessment and Impact Report is sent to them for approval. I'd like to also add that during the planning and reporting process of an activity that may impact a wetland, avoidance is a priority. However, if this is not possible, then it is required for impacts to be minimized and the wetland to be reclaimed later down the road. This is part of the mitigation strategy for responsible development. There's also a replacement process if wetland impacts cannot be avoided, minimized, or reclaimed. This would require a wetland replacement project or payment of a wetland replacement fee. There's a whole other set of policies, guides, and directives involved with this, so I won't get much further into it. The image above was taken on a road construction job, and it is a good example of the types of projects that require environmental scientists. Before the construction began, the area would have been scouted for things like wetlands and animal habitat. If a wetland was anywhere close to the area, we would have found it and did an assessment on it. As you can see, a report and application would have been written up and approved for the project to proceed. As I mentioned before, most of the work I've done is in the field, so I've actually gone out into the bush and looked for wetlands. This process involves walking a site of interest and identifying various plant communities, surface water connections, and disturbances. When me and my field leader find a wetland, we have to assess it. This requires a few different tasks. The first task is to classify it, and the second is to delineate it. There are 5 wetland classes recognized by Alberta Wetland Policy. From the class, it can be subdivided into forms and then subdivided again into types. To keep things relatively brief, I'll only highlight the 5 wetland classes. They are bogs, fens, marshes, swamps, and shallow open water. I think it's also important to note there are 2 broad groups of wetlands, a peatland and a mineral wetland. Bogs and fens are peatlands. Swamps, marshes, and shallow open water are grouped as mineral wetlands. The Alberta Wetland Classification System, which is where I got this table, is a key reference for fieldwork since it provides a collection of indicators for wetland identification. The Alberta Wetland Classification and Delineation Directive is also a key reference for accurately determining the ecological boundary of the wetland. The first wetland indicator is the accumulation of peat at the surface. Peat is non or partially decomposed organic material made up of moss species, vascular plants, or wooded debris. If there's more than 40 centimeters of peat, then the wetland is considered a peatland. For me, this is the easiest way of knowing I'm in a wetland because the ground is squishy. Peatlands in Alberta have relatively stable water tables, so the soil stays saturated. This reduces the rate of decomposition since there's a lack of available oxygen. Depending on the source of water, peatlands can be classified as a bog or fen. If the water seems to be exclusively from precipitation, then the wetland is ambrogenous and is a bog. If there's a variety of water sources, then it is monogenous and is a fen. When the water table moves up and down, oxygen becomes available for organic material to break down and become soil. When this happens in a poorly drained depressional area, there isn't much peat and it is considered a mineral wetland. So the source of water and water table describes the water regime in a wetland, which is the second indicator for wetland identification. Chemical gradients are the third identification indicator. Determining chemical factors of surface water, such as acidity and salinity, help us better understand the accumulation of minerals as well as the source of water. Chemical gradients are important for determining wetland types, so I won't get much further into it. Soil characteristics are the fourth indicator and are especially important when coming across mineral wetlands. Since it may be difficult to tell from the surface, we probe the soil and look for hydric soils that develop when soils have been wet for a period of time. Glaying and mottling are color changes in the soil near the surface, and it is what we're looking for. Glaying is when the soil turns gray and occurs when water depletes the oxygen and increases the molecular ratio of metals such as iron. Mottling is when there are rusty-looking patches in the soil. This happens after the water level drops, when the metals are exposed to oxygen and oxidize. Vegetation structure, anyways, is the final wetland indicator and is useful for determining wetland form. Vegetation structure often reflects hydrological processes with taller vegetation inhabiting areas with decreased water levels. There can also be shrubs, grasses, and aquatic plants depending on the wetland. Most plants in wetlands are often adapted to grow in saturated or flooded soil, so vegetation ID is definitely a useful skill for finding and classifying wetlands, as well as differentiating them from the upland. So I find it helpful to bring a plant book with me with a key so I can confidently identify species throughout the growing season. The picture above gives a good representation of the areas that I get to check out. I find this one in particular is pretty cool. Sometimes we get to use ATVs and UTVs, definitely a perk of working environment. And then, this is where we get to specific sites and then usually travel on foot from there. In addition to identification and classification, we must delineate the wetland that we found. This means that we determine and map the wetland boundary. This requires a good understanding of the wetland, the upland, and the riparian or transition zone. As I mentioned before, the Wetland Identification and Delineation Directive is a guide for determining ecological boundaries with the purpose of improving accuracy and consistency. Not only does it help with field methods, but also the desktop evaluation process. This is one of the applications of GIS. To give a better idea of what wetlands actually look like, I've attached a couple of images from Roy Northern projects and an image from Alberta Wetland Identification and Delineation Directive. On this slide, I show the 3 classes of mineral wetlands. The image in the upper left is a marsh. As you can see, it has lots of sedge and grass cover and would have been confirmed as a wetland by soil models. The bottom left image is shallow open water of an area that is likely flooded throughout the year. And on the right-hand side is a swamp. Its form is wooded coniferous because of the vegetation structure. When we came across this swamp, the moss, the water, the fallen trees, the hummocky terrain were good indicators it was a wetland. So we probed the soil to get a better understanding and start our assessment. There wasn't much peat, and we reached mineral soil with models close to the surface. So we were able to come to the conclusion it was a swamp. I don't know if you can tell here, but by the soil probe, if there's models in there, I'm not sure if you can tell or not, but in person, there's models in there. At a basic level, GIS is used to collect information about an area before we get to the field. This includes aerial photos, which helps us determine potential areas of interest. When there isn't much vegetation and the landscape is open, this process is relatively easy. We would then follow up with the scout and survey to assess and delineate the wetland. The environmental information we collect in the field, which is usually done on an iPad, becomes georeferenced, meaning it has coordinates. It's also important to note the use of surveyors during this process. They are responsible for accurate field delineation and coordinates to create maps used by project managers and legislative bodies. This slide shows the two different classes of peatlands found in Alberta. In the top left corner, I attached a picture of a fen with a wooded coniferous form. And in the bottom left corner is a bog, also with a wooded coniferous form. The fen was likely classified by deep peat, short black spruce, and understory vegetation dominated by sedges and dense mats of bryophytes. The bog was likely classified by deep peat, stunted black spruce, and sphagnum moss. A wide variety of vascular plants are found in fens, but not in bogs. So species like buckbean and mud sedge are helpful indicators when classifying peatlands in the field. Both of these photos were part of Roy Northern projects, and our talented team of biologists, agrologists, and qualified wetland science practitioners made the assessment and delineation. To the right is an aerial photo of a bog surrounded by a fen in the boreal ecoregion of Alberta. Using aerial photographs are a practical method of identification and delineation, since images can be imported into GIS software and used as a base map upon which wetland boundaries can be digitized and submitted to the regulatory body, in our case, Alberta Energy Regulator. For interpreting the ecological boundary of a wetland from a desktop, a highly qualified skill set is required. Unfortunately, I'm not quite there yet, but I think if I keep this up, it's a skill I'll definitely have in the future. Image selection is important for this method, and the criteria require images to have high resolution, be recent, and to capture the wetland in a time of year that is easiest to identify and delineate. This means a photo of a wetland covered in snow won't do the trick, especially if it's 40 years old. Although air photos may seem innovative when it comes to classifying and delineating wetlands in a large area, there are other methods that are more advanced to assist with wetland management and the field processes involved. These methods include satellite imagery and remotely sensed data. During my time researching GIS methods, I have been fortunate enough to have the help and guidance from an expert in this highly technical field of science. Dr. Laura Chasmer from the University of Lethbridge has been my academic supervisor during my project. Dr. Chasmer's research involves using geospatial, hydrometeorological, and field data to better understand boreal wetlands, forest, and discontinuous permafrost change with natural and disturbed environments, as well as the environmental processes that both influence and are affected by these changes. Her research uses a broad range of cutting-edge methodologies and remote sensing data. To provide a little more context, remote sensing is the process of collecting and measuring radiation data that is being reflected or emitted from the Earth's surface. This process is done from a distance, typically from satellites or an aircraft, but it has come to my attention that drones are now capable of remote sensing to some extent. The data can then be integrated into GIS systems to detect and monitor physical characteristics of the Earth. The academic work of Dr. Chasmer has and continues to be a significant part of my research. From her, I am beginning to understand the perspective of how remote sensing can be applied to assist wetland scientists, land use managers, and policymakers. In her review paper shown here, she states that wetland extent, condition, and changes can be accurately monitored over time using various remote sensing methods, and that the capabilities of remote sensing are rapidly expanding. The information that makes it possible to classify wetlands and other landscape features include, but are not limited to, water extent, topography, and vegetation structure. In remote sensing technology, there is also a variety of sensor types that can measure different radiation properties. Some systems even emit and recollect their own radiation to measure physical characteristics of the land. It's important to note here that radiation in this case is not harmful or dangerous. In Chasmer et al. 2020, there were 5 sensor types that were reviewed for wetland classification, each of which with various sensor names, accuracies, and applications. The first type was aerial photography, which is a method I mentioned earlier. It is considered the primary interpreter for landscape classification and wetland classification. But as I also mentioned, it's time consuming even for somebody highly skilled. More complex sensor types include multispectral sensors, which can collect energy across several discrete wavelengths within the electromagnetic spectrum. A step above that is hyperspectral remote sensors, which can detect energy across several hundred wavelengths within the spectrum. Both of these sensors have been found to have an impressive variety of applications for wetland assessment. The fourth sensor type is called synthetic aperture radar, or SAR for short, and it emits radio waves down to Earth to detect soil moisture characteristics based on the collection of the returning backscatter energy. The fifth and final sensor type is LiDAR. This stands for light detection and ranging because it rapidly emits laser pulses and measures the timing and intensity of the laser pulses that return. This provides the ability to detect vegetation structure characteristics and ground surface elevation at high resolution. With the different sensor types in mind, remote sensing can add valuable information required for responsible wetland management. This includes determining wetland extent on a larger scale, which would be useful for baseline inventory and long-term monitoring. Also, wetland characteristics such as hydrology, water cycling, biogeochemistry, and productivity can also be identified. Like I said, this is a large and complex scientific field, and I've had to read a lot more scientific papers just to begin to understand these processes and applications. Since I have many hours of remote sensing research ahead of me, I will only highlight a few methods that I found particularly useful for the fieldwork that I'm involved with. However, I want to emphasize that the potential of remote sensing for environmental management is astounding, and its possibilities almost seem endless. The field tools that I intend to implement into my work moving forward involves the use of existing GIS layers and inventories, as well as the use of LiDAR. In this instance, an inventory is an aerial imagery-based collection of data that has already been developed by the government, private companies, or academics. This means that wetland vegetation and ground cover data, to name a few, can be downloaded into GIS software, and baseline wetland extent, indicators, and drivers of wetland condition can be estimated from a desktop. Inventories provide a strong start for identifying environmental conditions and extents prior to entering the field. This can help save time, money, and resources since the majority of fieldwork would only require ground truthing. Physical wetland assessments would still be required. However, this is helpful for field preparation to ensure due diligence. The picture on the left is an example of what an inventory layer looks like when it's uploaded into GIS software. This was an area south of Grand Prairie, Alberta that I was looking into, and it shows a few swamps and a marsh that have already been classified near creek along Highway 40. So if there was a proposed project in this area, I would refer to this map beforehand to get an understanding of what is there. I could also upload this map to my phone so I know where I'm at in relation to these features. Alberta Merged Wetland Inventory, Derived Ecosite Phase, Earth Observation for Sustainable Development of Forests, and Alberta ground cover classification are among the inventory examples that I have looked into so far. But I believe there are hundreds of different inventories out there. The applications of LiDAR that I have looked into includes the creation of 3D forest models. The photo on the right is what something like that could look like. Since LiDAR maps the surface with laser pulses and returns, functions such as surface geometry, contact area, and reflectance are collected. This specialized data can be used to detect vegetation structure and ground surface elevation. This can then be applied to wetland classification, vegetation metrics, productivity, change, connectivity, etc. Application of LiDAR vegetation structure also includes estimating biomass, carbon, habitat, merchantable timber, volume, and wildfire fuel. To keep things in this category relatively brief, I will only explain three simple products, relatively simple products created with LiDAR. They are digital elevation models, which create a 3D representation of the bare earth surface and topography. Digital surface models, which capture the natural and artificial features of the environment. And finally, canopy height models, which is the difference between elevation and surface, and represents the height of trees and shrubs. Over the next few weeks, I'll dive deeper into LiDAR application and processing to learn even more about the landscapes that I'm interested in. And that's something I'm very interested and excited for. So that kind of wraps up my presentation on environmental solutions and GIS methods for wetland assessment and impact. I hope I was able to provide some useful information in regards to wetlands, the policies and legislation that is involved with development and sustainability, as well as the huge potential of GIS and remote sensing. I'd like to finish up by saying thank you, SFC, for this opportunity. My team at Roy Northern, especially my project manager, Tracy, Dr. Laura Chasmer, and everyone who took the time today to learn about my research. Also, shout out to my teammates at PBA, go Dogs. Before I provide my list of sources, I thought I would add a couple more pictures that I've taken while doing environmental work. If there are any in particular that are interesting, I would gladly talk more about them. So yeah, thank you again. I'd be happy to discuss really anything. If there are any questions or comments, I'd be happy to talk about those as well. And I'm also trying to be a big LinkedIn network guy, so feel free to reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn.
For sure. Great. Thank you. That was really great, Aaron. I enjoyed hearing more about your work. My biggest takeaway is that squishy soil means peatland. So I'm certainly going to
Yeah,
think about that every
helps.
time I set foot outside. Okay, I know we have some questions here from our co-hosts, so I will defer to them first. Tatiana, environment science girl, let's hear it.
Awesome. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation, Erin. That was super, super awesome. I graduated from environmental studies, so we touched on similar topics, but I definitely didn't get as scientific as this, so it was super cool. I think so. There's a lot of undervaluing or misconceptions around wetlands. Like some people just see them as these wet, murky places with just a bunch of
Yep,
mosquitoes, but obviously there's so
absolutely.
much more than that. Yeah. So could you maybe speak to, like, I know wetlands are one of the most biodiverse ecosystems. So why is it so important to maintain the integrity of these incredibly biodiverse environments, and why is that important for both the planet as well as for people?
Well, I think with wetlands, they're just such a unique ecosystem in terms of like soil and chemistry and all that stuff. So it provides just very unique places for different plant communities, different animal communities. And I think all of those are just very essential for like entire ecosystems. Um, and like things like I was actually talking with my project manager here the other day, and woodland caribou. I think I mentioned that they rely on these ecosystems, and once like wetlands are kind of sensitive, and they're in danger, then that kind of will relate to the caribou and stuff like that, right? So that will play an even bigger part on kind of ecosystem science and community science. And yeah, you just kind of got to look at kind of the big picture with wetlands.
Yeah, so again, thank you so much, Erin. I don't know a ton about watersheds, so I really appreciate it. I was really curious about if there's a minimum distance that must be maintained for resource development to be considered in avoidance of wetlands.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. And with the work that I'm involved with pipelines, pad sites, access roads, all that sort of stuff, depends on the project that's involved for setbacks, usually like 100 meters. And then also depending on the quality of the wetland. So things like shallow open water are definitely um, more things are put in place to protect them, and things like springs, freshwater, are also big, so bigger setbacks. Some things, depending on what's considered the environmental impact, like pipelines, like horizontal directional drilling, where they go underneath, is low impact. So some things like that don't require setbacks actually at all. So it just kind of depends on the wetland itself and then the project.
Awesome, thank you. And then a bit along the same vein, how long does reclamation generally take for wetland? And are there certain targets that companies must hit?
I'm actually not too sure. I'm more involved with the kind of pre-project kind of assessments rather than actual reclamation work. It's definitely something I hope to get into, but I'm not quite there yet, so I'm not too sure.
Of course, no problem. Appreciate it.
For sure. Okay, we have one question from the audience. Thanks, folks. You take that picture of the bears.
I did. I actually did. I was driving, I think, to a site, and yeah, just two black bear and brown bear were out near the road, and it's always a fun part about my job. I find getting to see things like elk and grizzly bears and black bears and lynx are really cool to go see out there.
So you mentioned like your work in oil and gas. I was wondering what excites you about your future in natural resources.
Oh, I think I like working with the resource industry because I think it's headed in kind of the right direction in terms of sustainability, and I want to be on that right side of it. Um, yeah, and I think it's so important for like the economy in Canada's economy too. So yeah, I think there's just so much opportunity, and I think that's kind of why I chose it.
How much GIS do you use in the field?
How much GIS? It's something. Well, we have a GIS department in with for Roy Northern, so they handle most of that stuff. But since it's kind of an interest to me, and I've got a little bit of background in it, it's something I'm trying to just kind of squeeze in a little bit more, especially if I start taking on my own project. But every single project that we do has multiple different GIS applications in terms of making the maps before we go out, as well as making the maps to kind of create a final product to send to AER.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Certainly something you can look forward to, growing into maybe with Roy Northern. You've touched a little bit on your experience with Dr. Chasmer. She's a wonderful lady. What made you choose your program and the University of Lethbridge, and what's some advice you might have for folks looking to do something similar?
Okay, so I chose Dr. Chasmer because she had background with remote sensing and GIS. I chose environmental science because I feel like I wanted to be outside, get my hands dirty, still with like that strong background in biology and geography. And if I got any advice, I think just try to get some work experience in, and that can really help just kind of help you in which direction you want to take your career. Like I feel I got lucky and got on with Roy Northern when I was pretty early into my schooling. And then it just really helped me just know what I wanted to do and what I didn't want to do. And yeah, and it helped me kind of pick out my courses and my interests kind of through there. And I think it's definitely been helpful so far for me.
That's great. Yeah, we hear from so many people that it's that field experience that really gets them kind of going in the right direction in school for sure. So we'll go with the final question here. What is your hope for resource sectors moving forward?
My hope? What is my hope for resource sectors? I hope that we get sustainability and we still live in a beautiful environment that's not impacted too heavily within 50, 100, 150 years. And I hope we will be able to keep doing it.
Definitely, yeah, and I think we're certainly headed in the right direction here. We're seeing a lot of companies make some positive change with ESG stuff, and involving young people, and yeah, it's really impressive work for sure. Okay, great. Well, I think that about wraps up our time for tonight. Thank you so much for your time and expertise, Aaron.
Thank you.
Alrighty, and thank you everybody for attending. Take care, folks, and remember to connect with us and with Aaron on social media at Students for Canada on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Good night, everybody.